Okay, today is Wednesday, January the 11th, 2023. Woo-hoo. Happy New Year, everybody.
Same to you.
Uh, Great. So today we're doing a class on land contracts. And I've bought and I've sold through land contracts over the years. They are a tremendous way to kind of help build your growth, your wealth as well, and your growth in the real estate business by being able to acquire something on a land contract. Because number one, you're not tying up versus buying something all cash. You're not tying up all your money, and you might be able to acquire an additional property. So, at one point in my career, I was representing an investment company, and we were out there in acquiring different properties, whether for rentals or to flip them. And that gave me the opportunity to kind of deep dive into land contracts a little bit more. So we bought a few properties on land contract through that company, and we also sold some properties on land contract through that company. So what it does is kind of opens up your buyer pool. Typically, when we just came through the market that we did in the last 5-6 years, when it's been pretty easy to get a mortgage, right? Well, those things are a lot more difficult now because of the interest rates, and not everybody's going to be able to qualify to get a standard type mortgage. So here we have as an option is a land contract. So land contract is basically the seller now becomes the bank. There is no bank involved. The seller's the bank. So the seller takes on the risk of having the transaction go to fruition, and then hopefully everything goes well. And at one point, you're either going to be able to close out the land contract or you can extend it on. So there's a lot of variables, a lot of things that have to be discussed and really fully understood before you move forward on these. So if you, as a realtor, okay, you're going to do two things. Whenever you're looking for a land contract, there's a couple different ways to do that. So you can go on the MLS, and one of the finance types that you can check on there, it says land contract. So you could pull, let's say, all of Wayne County and go to the finance tab and check land contract, and it'll show you all the properties that are available right now under land contract. That doesn't mean that somebody else might not be willing to sell you that house on a land contract. That means up front, they've already probably discussed it with the seller, and the seller is okay with, hey, I'll look at it. If a good offer comes in, I'll look at it. Go ahead, Charlie. You can interrupt anytime.
Okay. I was under the impression you needed to own the home for it to be able for us to do a land contract. The seller needs to own it, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's Mr. Seller. You own the home, and you want to sell your house. So as an option, or to a buyer that's coming in, that you might want to offer a land contract. And you would do that if you weren't worried about getting all the money up front, from the sale. Because most people want the money up front. Most people want all the money. So that's not attractive to them, a land contract. But let's say I'm, maybe even at my point in my life where I'm like maybe looking for more of a steady stream of income. And I would have a monthly payment coming in, and I wouldn't have to pay a lump sum penalty or taxes on that money that derived from the sale, especially on an investment property, because it can't be deferred. So maybe that's an option, so that I've got like a monthly payment that comes in every month. And so it's a residual income for me to, look forward to, right? So, but there's always risk, and, in just about everything there's risk, right? So here it's like, well, you want to minimize the risk, right? So there's a lot of things that we're going to do. We'll talk about through the addendum. But pretty much you start this out with, if you're going to make an offer, you will use our purchase agreement, okay? Our standard PA, because there's a lot of info in there that will pertain to a sale of a property. And the things we need to do. We talk about possession. We talk about inspection. We talk about title. A lot of information in our purchase agreement so that needs to be part of the land contract. And then we drafted this land contract addendum. So maybe this is dated 2020 when I revised this. So I went through a painstaking effort to simplify this process, because prior to that, KW really didn't have a form. There were 2, 3 different kind of board forms out there, and each one did different things. So I kind of tweaked the 3 or 4 boards that were available, tweaked what was available to us, talked to our attorney, and put together this addendum with, I think it's on 2 pages, basically gives you and provides you with the questions, and you get the answers to make everybody happy in the transaction. So, the purchase agreement, you're going to have the purchase price. You'll have on there, when it talks about financing, one of the check boxes is down below. I think it's number C, letter C, where it says land contract. And then it says see additional land contract addendum. So this is the form that you would accompany. So you fill out the purchase agreement, and you all know how to do that. So, but then when you get to this is, really defines the terms of the contract, the land contract. So there was a lot of confusion on how this really works. But this, to me, really simplifies it in the first few paragraphs here, lays out the actual terms. Because in the purchase agreement, it just gives you the price. So that's what you would plug in here. The purchase price, you plug it in here. But it says, and obviously the descriptive of the property, right? It says with the down payment and the amount of. So this is where it's critical. If I'm the seller, I want as much money down as possible. Okay. So what's typical? What's a good number? What should I be looking for? So typically I would never sell a house for probably less than 20% down. Because in my mind, and I dealt with, a lot of distressed properties in my career. So I always would look at it this way. If that house goes vacant and it gets vandalized, can I put that house back together again with the money I've already received? Okay, so that's how my downstroke's based on that. So if you've got a house that's got a furnace, hot water tank, kitchen, plumbing fixtures, maybe you got 20 grand in. Okay, so I would at least want to minimal cover that expense. God forbid something happens and the people you sold it to are just a total piece of work, and they destroy the house on the way out, right? And this happens. So at least I've got some money already. I'm going to redeem the property back, okay, through foreclosure or eviction. And then, I've got to repair it and obviously sell it again. So that's how I look at what's a good down payment, okay? So when you see in the MLS, when somebody says, as little as 5% down, I get real concerned about what else is involved in that 5% down, because probably, and this is what happens too, is when you see land contracts, and especially on lower end homes. We just had one of the agents last week, and she sent me the packet to look at it, and I'm like, well, this house is extremely overpriced. Did you do your comps? She goes, yeah. What did you come up with? And yeah, she says it was, well, everything's $30,000 less. I go, well, that's why they're asking for 5% down, because they're getting more money than they should probably. So it still needs to be a fair amount that somebody's, offering to sell it at. But what I see too often is that price is elevated or escalated to, again, minimize some of the risk. So you'll be buying or paying more, the buyer will be paying more for that house than they probably should. But some buyers are okay with that, because this is maybe the only option they have to buy a house, because whatever reason their credit's jacked up and they can't get a mortgage. And I've had, a couple of situations. This is a great example, actually. When we were selling one of our investment properties, we bought it, we flipped it, we fixed it, we put it back on the market. And the person that wanted to buy it was a doctor. And I was kind of surprised that she didn't apply for a mortgage because her credit was excellent. We scrubbed her pretty good. And she just said, well, I just started a new practice. And because I have no job history, no income stream, the bank won't lend me any money. So I'm looking for a short-term land contract until I'm able to refinance, pay you off, and move on. So she was like golden. I mean, her credit score was over 800. So any bank on the planet would have lent her money. Plus, she's a doctor, right? the reality was she couldn't get a loan. So this was the only vehicle that was out there. So took it back to the owners. We talked about it, because ultimately they're making a decision. And they go, yeah, it sounds solid. And sure enough, I think she paid us off in like a year and a half.
If you want to.
Pardon?
No, because it's going to disturb you. I'm okay.
Yeah. So, coming up with that right down payment, right? So and that was a 20% down. She had some cash, but again, wasn't able to get a mortgage because of her business situation, not because of really any bad finance or bad, bankruptcies and things like that in the past. But that's typically the buyer that's going to come to you and start asking questions about land contract. It's usually going to be a buyer with some damaged credit. And, so that puts the burden back on the seller now, who is the bank, and so am I going to lend you money? I'm going to let you buy my house. How am I going to determine if you're a good buyer or not? So they do the same thing like a mortgage company should be doing on the selling end. You're going to scrub that buyer, I call it. You're going to, just like if it's a tenant coming in, you're going to look for all the prior history you can get on that particular buyer. You're going to pull a credit report. You want to see what their debt to income ratio is. And even more importantly than that, I always feel is more their employment history. How long have they been at their job? To me is critical, let alone how much are you making. So if you've got somebody that's really hasn't job hopped and hasn't, been here for 6 months, there for 8 months, there for 10 months, that's never a good sign either. So if they've got some longevity at their work, then, that's a solid candidate. They've been able to hold their job for X amount of years. They're making a decent income. And then the only thing you would be checking is their debt to income ratio so that they're not, overselling themselves with, maybe 2 car payments and a house payment, and child support, and who knows what else could be on there. But, you still got to look into them pretty deep to make sure they're a viable candidate. And again, when we came out of the last recession, there were many people that had damaged credit, whether they had a short sale or foreclosure, and but they still had cash money because basically they weren't paying their payment for a long time. So they were able to secure a land contract with a lot of people too. So there's always options on, what works and what doesn't work for somebody. But the key to me, if I'm the seller, I want a strong down payment. I'm not so worried about the interest rates. And I'm not, so right now, let's say the average mortgage is 6 something, right? 6% plus. So what would be your rate on a land contract? So typically it was 2 to 3 points over prime. So, if we're at 6 in a bank on a land contract, I'm probably going to be about 8% now, right? Which sounds high, but relative to what's going on in the mortgage business, it's not that bad. It's only 2 points higher. So 8% return on your money is a good investment. It's a real good investment. So those different ways of looking at that, how you spread out that gain, right? So then you're talking about how much money down, and then what is going to be the
Steve, I have just one quick question before we go back
Sure.
before we
Yeah.
move forward. So the purchase price, would that price be whatever is, how are we determining that? Is it determined when?
It's advertised on the MLS. It's a listing on the MLS. There's a list price on there, and that's either a good or a bad price.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you come in. So you're gonna guide that buyer accordingly. Like, maybe it's a little overpriced, but this is the only way you're gonna be able to buy a house. Okay, but you gotta go on record to say that, hey, that's a great price, or it's a decent price, or it's overpriced, like we did in this house in East Point last week. I'm like, this is way overpriced. It wasn't even close. And they were, the terms that they were wanting on a land contract were like, no. So I told the client, I says, as the agent brought us together, and I said, listen, you need to talk to an attorney. First of all, they gave us their land contract, and I didn't like it at all. I usually don't review those when they're not our documents, but I said, I'll take a look at it. I have all that. I go, I don't like it at all. I said, but you really need to have an attorney look at it. And sure enough, as soon as that happened, they backed out because there was some language in there that really shouldn't be in there. And people draft their own land contracts, and they want people to sign them. But you gotta have somebody review those, and that's really not your realtor. I don't think we're qualified. I think they really need to have an attorney always look at these documents, because there's always penalties and fines. So what we found, again, coming out of the last recession was that if the buyer defaulted, the first month, the bank was able to foreclose, or the seller was able to foreclose on the property. That was written into the land contract. So you're late once, life happens, stuff happens, right? Things get in the way. You might be a little late on a payment, or you might be, almost having to skip a payment before you catch up again. It happens. But built into that contract, and this happened more than you want to know, it was a default. So technically the seller could redeem the property in that whole process. And you got to watch out what the language is on how that all happens with foreclosures and redemption. So that needs to be addressed in the land contract. So I've got a whole bunch of stuff I've saved over the years that I want to send you guys, since you're taking the time to take the class. And it's stuff that you can read later. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but it outlines the risk for the seller and it outlines the risks for the buyer. There's things you should look out for. So it's some great information that when I usually go to legal updates, when we used to do these in person, we would have legal updates, and the MAR attorneys would put on these 2-hour legal con eds. You would attend, and the great information came out of it. I always save all that stuff. It's still relevant. If it's 10 years old, it's still relevant. It doesn't matter. It's the same process. It's just, how do I protect my client, right? And their best interest. Or if I'm buying, what do I need to look out for? So here you've got, here with a land contract addendum. This is actually 3 pages. Ours is here. You've got the price, which will match what you have on the purchase agreement. You fill out all the other stuff on the PA like normal. And then whatever the down payment is, the dollar amount, and typically it's you would make that a round number, just for simplicity's sake. You could do a percentage, but here more than likely it's going to be a round number of 10,000, 20,000, something like that. And then how long are we going to do this land contract? How long do we want to have it in play before it needs to be paid off or it's paid off? So typically, most land contracts will not be paid off during the term that's on the contract. Typically, there will be a balloon payment due at the end. In other words, there's a lump sum there's a balance owed before that property can change over and really fall all into the buyer's hands. Because what happens with the land contract is that buyer only owns that little portion of the house, of their down payment. So the seller still has the majority interest. And if I'm putting 20% down, well, that's my interest in that home. That 20% is what my equity is basically in that home. So if there was an insurance claim, this is where it really comes into play. The seller still has to be a named insured, just like the mortgage company is. When you get a mortgage, they go on your insurance policy so that if there's a loss, that they're paid off first before you are, the balance. So if the seller's got, let's say, 80% equity, God forbid there was a fire, that seller would be made whole before you got paid off. So that's, some of the pros and cons again, right? But you don't get the deed to the house at the consummation of the land contract. You only get the deed once it's paid off. So that seller still has that interest. Like every month, payments are coming in, the balance gets a little bit less. When you see the spreadsheets, every month the balance gets a little bit less. So the buyer's interest gains at the same time that the seller's is going down. But typically, most of the land contracts will have a balloon at the end. In other words, there's some type of balance. So then you have to determine what happens at that point. So let's say if we're going to say the remainder to be paid within 60 months would be 5 years, right? So 3 to 5 years is what I see as typical for a land contract. You could do it sooner. You could extend it out further if you want, but that's typical. You'll see 3 to 5 years. So at the end of 60 months, and the interest rate is, let's say, 8% here, it acknowledges that all parties acknowledge that the land contract will or will not be paid off after in this case, 5-year term. Okay, so everybody knows. Nobody can say, I didn't know that. You never told me that. I understand fully that there will be a balloon payment due of approximately, and this is not etched in stone, but you've got a ballpark. You're going to use a mortgage calculator, okay, to come up with this amount. So we all should have those things. We have them on RealComp. There's a mortgage calculator. I think it's in Command. There's apps. I use the app on my phone, and I just plug it in. And all this is typically, it's all based on a 30-year amortization schedule. So my monthly payment would be the same as if I was taking out a 30-year mortgage. That's what we see typically. So there's a couple different ways of working that. You can do one lump sum per month, okay? A flat fee of like, say, $1,000 a month, every month, okay? Now, out of that 1,000, and we'll go into it in a minute, how much of that is principal and interest, okay? So we break it down that way. So that's including interest, but typically we'll take a 30-year mortgage. Let's say the balance is $100,000. We'll look at that. We paid $20,000 down. We have a balance of $80,000. So that $80,000, okay, that's what we're going to amortize over 30 years. That would be my monthly payment, but that's just for the mortgage, right? For the land contract piece. That doesn't include taxes and insurance. So those have to be dealt with, and that's what we do in the remaining of the document here. We'll talk about who pays what percentage. Does the seller pay it every year and gets reimbursed from the buyer, or we let the buyer pay it and then they show proof that the seller that they paid it? Because I'm the seller, I want to know, number one, you're paying a water bill, and I want to know the taxes are current and that you're not going to incur a huge balance, let's say in a couple of years, if you're not checking those things. So there's still an obligation on both parties to communicate to make sure those things are being taken care of and there are no issues. Any questions at this point?
Actually, yes, Steve. So I don't know if I missed this part, but because this is a land contract and we're using we're still using a PA, how are we determining our commission so that we are paid off of this?
Yeah, it's in the MLS.
Oh, it would be. So I guess I'm thinking if I'm representing the seller or the.
Yeah, it's still an MLS. So typically, again, it's going to be 3% in most cases. And you're paid on the dollar amount of the land contract, not on the down payment. So we still get paid.
Okay.
So that's another good point, though. Leads me to that. What do you get as a down payment? You got to make sure that it covers both commissions. All right. Otherwise, how is that going to get paid?
Yeah.
So at a minimum, the down payment should be at least 6%, so that each broker is paid off typically at, if we're talking 3 and 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you get how that works?
Yeah.
So if it's $100,000, it's still going to be a $6,000 commission that's split $3,000 and $3,000. So if I'm getting the down payment, I got to get at least 6, actually get more, because you're going to have closing costs. There are going to be some closing costs incurred. So that's another way to look at the down payment. You want to make sure that you're going to get paid, because otherwise now you're asking the seller to bring money, or who's going to bring money to pay the commissions, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the buyer can always pay the buyer agent commission. That's another negotiable item. It's not, even though it's in the MLS, might make your offer more attractive, right? So those are always options. But here it's a big deal that we acknowledge right out of the gate that there's going to be a balance at the end of the term of the land contract. So everybody understands, no surprises, no gray area. At the end of this land contract, let's say there could be a $70,000 balance. So now what happens, right? So the seller says, I want to be made whole. Mm-hmm. I want all my money. So you got to go out and get a mortgage. So if you can't get a mortgage, then you're going to probably have to sell a house. And then you got to pay off the land contract, because it's going to be registered, just like with a mortgage, it's going to be recorded, so that you still have to pay off the land contract, and what any other monies would be yours. If you had, like we went through the market that we just went through, if you bought 3-4 years ago, you would have a considerable amount of equity in that home, so you would make out like a bandit. But now, maybe not so much, because the market's gone back down again. So these are all things to take into consideration to find out if it works. But again, typically, this will work for somebody that has damaged credit, but
There are no
still
programs
has,
to help.
still has a good employment history, right?
Mhm.
What did you say, Charlie? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to ask, are there any programs that you're aware of if somebody needed help with that down payment, or that's only for a,
Land contract, I'm going to say no.
okay.
Yeah, not that you get the private money and that gets all, forget about it. That's it. Way too risky. So if my buyer's doing that and I'm the seller, I'm not warm and fuzzy, right? You don't have enough to cover the down payment, that's not a good sign.
Okay.
You know, entering into these things, right? All right, so we determined there's a balloon payment due at the end. Now we start asking a bunch of questions. All parties shall initial any clause which is part of this buy-sell agreement, mark NA in those that are not. So every line should have either a set of initials or an NA. So right off the gate, right, it says land contract, principal and interest payment. So are we going to include in our payment the principal and the interest? We could do an interest only. Okay, so the balance never changes. There's different ways of doing that. So then you would line out the principal part and put interest only payment of X amount of dollars, right? So then each person would acknowledge that with initials, not just a check mark, but we initial. Please shall initial any clause. Then the buyer agrees to pay all taxes, special assessments, appropriate premiums that are due and submit proof of payment to the seller within 30 days. Payment will be made to the proper taxing authority. So we're putting the burden on the buyer now, but you'll see below this, it says or. So this is one of the options. This is typically what will be initial, that we want the buyer to pay these taxes and be current with them and not delinquent. And also to make sure that if there's special assessments, like if it's a condo development and they get an assessment, it would be that buyer's responsibility to pay those assessments moving forward, not the seller. So that's the one option. Again, that's usually the one that most people will initial. But the other option is that the seller agrees to pay the taxes. And this is not a bad option because this way here, the seller knows they're being paid. There's no worry about there's a balance or delinquency there and possibly losing it to a tax sale, if you let this go too far in 3 years or more. So that's not a bad option either, but obviously you would increase your monthly installment that you're getting from the buyer to compensate for that you're paying the taxes. So maybe instead of getting $1,000, I'm going to get $1,400 and I'm going to take care of all that stuff. And if I'm the buyer, I want to make sure that the seller is paying them. And if I'm the seller, I'm the same thing. If I'm putting the burden on the buyer, I want proof that those taxes have been paid. When I say taxes, I encompass water. So you got to make sure the water bill is being paid as well. Okay. So this is number 2 is over 3. So if you're doing, typically you would initial 2 and you would put NA in 3 here. These are all in our DocuSign and in Remind, the same form.
So how does that work when the buyer is paying the taxes and things like that if it's still under the homeowner's name?
Yeah, they just pay it like anybody can pay them. Doesn't matter who pays them.
Okay.
Yeah, just get a receipt. You forward it back to the seller that, hey, I paid these taxes and they're current. And if you're the seller, you got to make sure they're getting paid. You don't want any surprises.
Right.
All right, so number 4 is the buyer agrees that an additional monthly payment which could be more money on top of the payment, which is an estimate of 1/12 of the annual taxes special assessment, shall be credited to the seller for the unpaid principal balance. Seller shall pay said taxes, special assessments, and insurance before any penalty attaches and adds amounts so paid to the principal balance of the contract. This amount may be adjusted periodically to the appropriate tax total sum of taxes and assessments. So you could break it down with, so the buyer is going to be paying, X amount of dollars per month based on, the monthly, what the taxes are for that month. So it's another way to say additional money. So let's say if you kept this at a flat fee, and then you would plug in a number here for the taxes and insurance. So the buyer's going to be paying the insurance on here too every year. So it's another way to kind of break it up, right? Because here it only deals with principal and interest in number one. Here we talk about who's going to pay it. And then here we talk about this is the additional monies that are going to go towards your taxes. So you would obviously you would initial here. So then we go into number 5. We said the buyer agrees to insure said property with hazard liability policy. So the buyer's got to maintain coverage on that home. You know, he's the homeowner now, but he also has to name the seller as a named insured. God forbid there's a loss, the seller will be paid off first, and then the buyer will be paid off. So this is a must initial. Everybody's going. You're not going to sell a house, and you're going to make sure that that buyer has insurance, just like the mortgage companies do before we close. You got to get that insurance policy, otherwise they're not going to give you a clear to close. Same thing here. Number 6, buyer's first monthly payment is due 30 days from the date of closing. Again, this is the one that's going to be typical. Taxes will be prorated as of the date of closing, just like a normal deal. Interest will begin to occur from the closing date, just like a normal deal. The seller occupies the property after closing. The seller will pay use and occupancy in accordance with the agreement of the sale. So again, even on a land contract, the seller could have post-closing possession. Okay, so you're going to either charge them for that or you're not going to charge them for that, depending on how sweet your deal is and how attractive you want to make it to the seller. Maybe you might not be charging an occupancy if they need to stay another 30 days after this closes. So you can still do it just like we do on a normal deal. You can still do it in a land contract. It doesn't mean you have to do keys at closing. Payments are due the first of the month, which typically I would always encourage people to put at the first of the month. It's just anytime you're doing a lease or a land contract, it's just way easier to maneuver and remember to keep things straight. In this case, the buyer will pay interest at closing for the period of the closing date for the following month. Again, this is the one you're going to initial because this is typical for what will happen in most cases. Go ahead. Are you raising your hand or are you just, Charlie, you good? Okay. Just talk, guys. I'm not watching you, you know, kind of, if you got a question, just let it out. Okay.
I did have one question about the insurance that they have to initially. So I get that they have to keep it, but so you're essentially just paying the insurance for the seller. Like, is there some additional insurance the buyer might be able to obtain so that they can get paid if there was a fire or something?
Well, you'll get paid your portion of this, you know, whatever the settlement is. You paid in X amount of percentage into the mortgage. Mm-hmm. You'll get paid that balance. Not, you won't get all the money.
Okay.
They're going to make the seller whole first. Okay. Because typically they'll have a majority interest in the home.
Okay.
On most land contractors, going to be a bigger balance that's due at the end. So the seller is still going to have really own more of that home technically than you do for insurance reasons. It's a little complicated, I get it, but what's the buyer's interest? The buyer's interest is what they paid in, right? If I paid 20 grand and the house is worth 100, then yeah, that seller needs to get the 80 out of that house if it's a total loss. And then, because he's already got the 20, and then I'll get reimbursed my 20 from the insurance company.
Okay.
And if there's any claims, that they handle it just like as a normal, the buyer now, even though it's a land contract, if there's water damage and their roof leak or when they need whatever damage, something fell on the roof, they would handle this just like a normal home. You'd file your claim, they would pay the claim. The seller just needs to know what's going on. They're not going to get like money out of that roof repair. They just want to know it's done. Okay. And then if you weren't doing the 30 days, it gives you the other option here where not the date of closing. So you would either do one of these two, but typically number 6 is going to be the one you're going to initial, and 7 would be an NA. It's another way to do the same payment structure. Number 8, a lot of discussion on this when we did this because really I haven't seen anybody in the last 15 years been able to take over a mortgage. The only one that typically you could do that would be a VA loan. There are some FHA loans that they'll allow you to somebody to acquire. But most mortgages, if I got a mortgage on my home, there'll be a due on sale clause in that mortgage. So you cannot, if you have a mortgage on your home and you want to sell it to somebody on a land contract, this is the other thing, you're probably going to have to pay off your mortgage. So you can't have the mortgage and be making those payments and then somebody's making the land contract, because the mortgage company is the second lien holder on your deal, your original deal. They're not gonna lose their position. So they're gonna want to be made whole, right? So that's where it gets complicated, where you can't really keep your old mortgage and then sell the house on a land contract. So if you don't have a land contract, the house is free and clear, or there's a smaller balance, and you could pay off that mortgage with the money you were getting as a down payment, fine. They'll close out the mortgage, they'll, whatever the balance is, they'll pay it off and you can sell it. But if there's going to be a bigger balance, you cannot sell it on a land contract and still then you, the original seller, keep paying your mortgage. It just doesn't happen like that. All of these lately will all have a due on sale clause. So that's why it's kind of capitalized, it's kind of bold. So just everybody acknowledging that. It's in most cases it'll be an NA, because there is none. But we couldn't take it out because it's still a possibility between the two different loan products, particular VA, where you can transfer it to another veteran. So at any time during the term of the land contract, the buyer may assume the existing mortgage. Sellers agree to reduce the principal balance of the mortgage other than the normal required. So this only applies if there is an existing mortgage. So again, this would be an NA. Number 10, buyer, and we went back and we put must initial on these. So it's got to be part of your conversation and part of the transaction. The buyer is to deliver at his expense to the seller a current credit report, employment letter, financing statement. So they're scrubbing the buyer. They're going to find out everything you can find out about that buyer to see if they're a legitimate buyer, if there's any credit history issue, any employment history issue, any criminal background issue. All these things can play into it. So that's the burdens on the seller. It's not us as the agent, right? So we have vehicles that the seller can use to pull that information, just like a landlord. Basically, they're going to be just like a landlord. They're going to pull all that information to find out as much as they can about that buyer. But the biggest conversations you're going to have is with the buyer's employer. You're going to ask for an employment letter to see how long they've been at their work, not just old W-2s. I want a letter from the employer that they're currently employed, number one, and how long they've been there, number two, and how much are they making, number three. All those things, you're going to need to know that. That's very important versus what their credit score is, I feel. I always felt that way as a landlord, same thing. Again, people have some highs and lows in life, life-changing events, things happen. They could have went through a bad streak, and they're still good people, still solid people, going to take care of your property, all the above, right? But maybe they just had a bad stretch. So you're going to take a risk. Again, it's up to the landlord. So they're going to initial these. So the buyer should be prepared that this is going to happen, so they know that they're going to pull this information. So if they've been trying to hide something and maybe not be upfront with you, it's going to come out in the wash here with this kind of procedure. Number 11, in the event the payment has not been received, so this is like a late payment charge. So typically you're going to put 7 days in here. If I don't get your payment within 7 days of the due date, you're going to be charged either a percentage or a dollar amount. And that will all depend on the total balance. So typically you could have, a 1%, you could have $100 in here, something like that. But 7 days I think that's fair. That leaves, really nobody's doing too much of mailing the payment anymore. If I'm doing a land contract, we're setting up electronic transfer. I want to know it's there the day it's supposed to be due and not late. So that'll be part of we would add that in here that the buyer is to, make the payments electronically every month to the landlord. You just add the verbiage in. So that's an initial, right? Seller agrees to execute a good and sufficient warranty deed at closing to be placed in escrow with the title company. So the seller still has to convey a clear title and provide a warranty deed for the buyer, but the buyer does not get the deed. Okay, the deed is going to be held with the title company, and this is where we get into a few problems. People forget about this, believe it or not. People forget that the deed is there. They go and they pay off the mortgage and they never get the deed. Now Mr. Buyer dies. Family comes in and says, wait a minute. He owns this house. Well, where's the payoff? Oh, nobody knows nothing. Nobody never talked to anybody, didn't tell anybody. So, and this has happened in the office here twice. So now you're trying to backtrack, and then you go and find out the title company's out of business. Now what the hell do you do, right? So again, you try to protect as best you can. The title company hopefully is a viable title company that'll be around, 5 or 10 years from now, so that they'll be available you can get that deed back, but you will not receive the deed until you pay off your mortgage, the land contract. So that's another way so that the buyer can't go and resell that house again, because there will be no deed available. And this should be recorded as well. When this transaction goes through and it closes, we want to record the land contract with the county so there's a record. And this will help too. God forbid something happens to the buyer, that they now have a record that it was recorded and who recorded. So it's a little easier to go back and try to backfill the pieces of what's missing in that situation, unfortunately. So that's a must initial. Number 13, we give the option to the buyer to maybe put a little bit more money down every month. Let's say you can work out, people have done after 6 months, we're going to give you another $5,000 lump sum that's applied towards the balance. Or, every month I'm going to give you another $500 in addition to the payment. Those are options. So that's what number 13 is for. Buyer and the seller understand that the regular monthly payments called for by the land contract will not pay the land contract amount owed in full by the end of the term of the contract. There will be a lump sum due. We have it in here in 2 spots. So the reason we do that, just so that nobody can ever say, I didn't know that, or nobody ever told me that. We got it in 2 spots. You got to sign and you got to initial this document. So remember, anytime anybody signs and initials, they're supposed to read what they're signing. This is part of the downfall of electronic signatures, I feel, where people are not taking the time to read the documents they're signing. Agents are not taking the time to go over these things like they should in person. So there's no gray area, no dispute. It's very hard to do unless you're doing it in person to understand the documents. So we have an obligation as an agent to do that on the listing side, on the buy side, that everybody, what you're signing, you understand. You can't plead ignorant in this country. You can't. When you go to court, the judge will ask you, can you read? Can you speak English? Yes. Can you read it? Yes. Then you're responsible for what you're signing. It's not like you needed an interpreter to tell you that. So people can't say, well, I didn't see that or I didn't read it. When you sign that document, you signed it. You're whatever that is, you're on the hook for it one way or another. Number 15, neither salesman, broker, this is a disclaimer, satisfactory mortgage available, such financing rates will be. So again, this is kind of a disclaimer for us. 16, buyers authorized to deduct from the land contract payment the Michigan transfer tax, the final payment. So typically, again, at a closing, somebody's got to pay the transfer tax, but in a land contract, we don't really technically have a full closing. We've got a partial closing. So the Michigan tax is not due until the land contract's paid off. So what will happen is whatever that tax is, and we'll know that at closing, that'll be deducted from either your last payment or your last 2 payments, whatever it takes to pay that off. That'll be part of the deduction. So that's when it's paid, is when a land contract is finally paid off, the state gets their money versus at the closing table. Now remember, this is always a negotiable item in a transaction, but here we're putting that the buyer is going to be deducting this because it's a seller responsibility on our purchase agreement. We put the burden on the seller, pay the transfer tax. It's right in the PA. But here with the land contract, so to make up for that, the buyer is going to take it out of their payment. So instead of giving $1,000 to the landlord, that $1,000 is going to go to pay the transfer tax to the title company. Number 17, seller is under no obligation to extend this contract beyond the agreed upon termination or refinance the principal balance. So quite often, I'm going to say it's about a 50-50 split between being able to pay it off or extend it. So some landlords will be more than happy to extend it, but usually this land contract is used as a bridge. It's a bridge for you to get time as the buyer to repair your credit, give you time to be able to get a mortgage, reestablish yourself, whatever tough times you went through, get your act together. And within 3 to 5 years, you should be able to, get a mortgage. But if you can't, your only option is you're going to be able to hopefully create another land contract with the same seller, or you're going to sell the property and hopefully pay off the seller and you. So those are things you have to be, as you approach that final date of the land contract, you're going to be having conversations probably within 6 months of that. Start having conversations with the landlord how this is all going to go. So there's no surprises, that you got time to apply for a mortgage if need be, or if you already know the landlord's going to extend for you. Number 18, the buyer has been advised that a survey should be obtained, just like on a mortgage. If there's one available, great. If not, the burden will fall on the buyer, that expense. And these are not cheap, okay? Most mortgage companies do not require a survey anymore. But if I was buying a piece of property and it wasn't just a clear-cut rectangle in a subdivision, cookie-cutter lot, I would be pretty apt to want to make sure that I get a survey so I understand my boundary lines. What's mine, what's not mine, how far can I go? Can I put a shed out here? Can I put a garage out here? Can I put an extension onto my house out here, either side? I'm going to want to know that before I enter into my contract. So, but they're not cheap. A typical lot it's almost over $1,000 for a survey now. So just keep that in mind. But those are good things to have if you're going to do any type of alterations to the property. If you've got a fence, if you want to put up a fence, you almost have to get a survey because you cannot assume where your property lines are.
Do you have to do that before you assume the property, or can you do that when you, once you're in there?
You can do both, but if you got any question about where my property line might be, you should do it as part of your contingency, part of your inspection process, to get the survey company out there to stake it out so I can make sure that this is what I'm buying, no gray area. These are my lot lines. Is that tree line there? Is that that fence is here now, but it doesn't look like it's on my land. Those are kind of, and fences, we have a lot of disputes with fences. The people put them up on the wrong spot. We had somebody that just went 2 feet encroached into somebody else's land for 2 feet. And then when the new buyers took it over, they did the survey and they made that buyer, that other seller next door, the owner, take the fence down because they never bothered to get a survey, and whoever put it up wrong. But that's not easy. That costs money. Usually you got to get an attorney involved, they got to go to the city involved. So it's good to know that stuff up front if there's any kind of thought there might be an issue. 19, if any part of the property or interest is sold or transferred to the buyer without the seller's prior consent, the seller at the seller's main option declare all sums due. And so you can't sell the property. Somebody could try to weasel to sell it on another land contract to somebody that doesn't know what they're doing. But right away, they would, once they went to court, the seller would prevail, the current seller, and the person that bought it would be SOL. Number 20, all parties agree and affirm that they've reviewed each initial clause in this. So again, everybody is going to get an initial or an NA at every clause, the 20 clauses here. Just reaffirming that. The land contract is subject to an attorney review or approval. Always encourage everybody to have an attorney review these documents, especially these are a little more complicated when you add in this addendum plus the PA. More generalities here. When the land contract is finally paid in full, the closing title company, and make sure you document who the title company is, because again, I told you, God forbid something happens to either party, we want to know who kind of quarterbacked this transaction and got it closed in case they don't have supporting documents. So it's good to, so we added it right in here. Who is the title company that's closing it? And we must let them know when it's finally paid off so they can release the deed to the buyer. Now the buyer will get the deed and the buyer can do what they want with the home. And the seller will be out once it's paid off. Everybody signs it. You can have the agent sign it and acknowledging that. The seller agent signing and acknowledging that. So we got, 4 or 5 parties all signing this. So everybody's on board with this, how it's going to happen. So this is our land contract addendum. Again, it's in the library of forms. It's under the addendums tabs too. I've grouped all the addendums into one group, make it easier to find. But when you go to the search engine, you can just type in land contract and it'll pop up. GMAR will pop up, MAR will pop up, and you can take a look at those. Detroit Realtors had a nice land contract too. So we've incorporated all that stuff into ours. And I think ours is about user-friendly as you're going to get, because these will close with a title company. They will prepare all the documents just like everybody normally does. Any questions on this before we move on to a couple other things? All right. So some of the handouts that I've got for you are pretty extensive. And they're handouts that I've got when I attended different legal updates with attorneys talking about different parts of the real estate business and how it affects us. And so one of them was on land contracts. So I've got some great info to pass on to you that you can read it. I don't need to read all this stuff. Tells you the pros and cons, pretty much what we went through the addendum. It outlines what's statute, what's not statute. In other words, what's required, what's not required. And it also tells you typically, this is how it's handled. This is who pays what. It talks about the insurance policy that you need to have. It talks about who pays the taxes. It talks about default. This is a big deal. What happens if the buyer defaults? What triggers the foreclosure process? The forfeiture, notice of forfeiture right here. What triggers all that? What's the remedies, right? A lot of verbiage here. But this is, if you're going to do one of these, really sit down and read these documents. It really goes through in much more detail than I just went over. I kind of went over the highlights of the addendum. But also gives you some hypotheticals, gives you some case history on what's happened on some of these land contracts. So that'll be something that I'll be sending you. There's even more stuff. What's the land? The land contract is the guide. What is it? What distinguishes it? And in Michigan, why would someone choose to sell a property using a land contract? It's great information here. Some of the stuff we've already talked about, but one other thing: the seller may be able to realize a greater overall profit by the sale of by earning interest. The seller may charge interest up to 11%. That's the maximum. That's a usury maximum. You cannot charge more than 11% on a land contract. And that's been pretty fixed for a long, long time. So now we're, at 6% on a regular mortgage. I'm going to say, like we talked about earlier, that maybe 8% is a good number for a land contract now, because again, You're going to charge a little bit more because of the risk that goes along with a land contract. Because the bank, no, there's no bank. Seller is the bank. The seller takes the risk that, yeah, everything is going to go according to plan. Yeah, that buyer's not going to mess up my house, not strip it on the way out, not damage things. They're going to take care of it. All those things come into play. So you want to try to minimize the risk. Again, we talked about with a higher down payment and a decent but not gouging interest rate. Again, those things are all negotiable. How much I'm putting down, what your interest rate is, how long the term of the contract, the land contract, again, typically 3 to 5 years. What you should consider if you're selling, what you should be looking out for if you buy. Again, we talked about earlier with you really need, as a realtor, and you've got a prospective buyer as a land contract, you got to still do your work. And your work is to make sure that's a good deal. They're not getting gouged. Because too often, like I said before, the prices on these are higher than they really should be. So you know, if that's the only option, again, for the buyer, then that, you know, be it as it may. But you want to make sure that they're not really getting gouged and way overpaying for that property. Because if they lose it, they won't be able to sell it and get a single penny out of it if they haven't, you know, if they bought at the wrong price. So that's our job as a realtor, to make sure that they're not getting gouged.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on, you said have an attorney look over it. So our attorney, or if in what case would we need the attorney to look over the
No,
contract?
we don't really have an attorney. Okay.
Well,
we-
the attorney usually recommend for the office. I think is it right?
Correct. Yeah, I've got 4 attorneys that we recommend.
Okay.
So I always provide that list. So our attorney, I'm going to say our attorney, okay, is actually part of our office. He's on my team. All right. We partner up on commercial transactions, is why he's part of my team. He is our E&O attorney. So if you screw up, you make a mistake, you know, or you're being something to do with anything within the context of the transaction, then that comes into play. But counseling buyers and sellers, they do not do. We're not attorneys, right? So again, we should always be reviewing other documents, but we should also be telling the client that you might want to have, or you should have, an attorney review these documents as well, especially if it's not a form that you're familiar with. Okay. And every purchase agreement, this is one of the downfalls of Michigan. There's 5,000 purchase agreements out there. Every brokerage has got a different PA. Everyone. If they're using the boards and they're a little more standardized, but they're all different, and you got to read them. Part of your job as a realtor, so look them over. Make sure, how are the taxes being taken care of? Who's paying what? Who's doing what with the transfer tax? Who's paying, you know, all the things that go into that, the title policies, things like that. Who's paying that? What kind of policy am I getting? That's our job, right? To check those things out. Where I'm at now in Carolina today, 1 PA. The whole state uses the same PA. It's a beautiful thing. So, you know, nobody's going to sneak anything in on you, because this is what happens. People change those. People add verbiage that you really sometimes shouldn't be there. You would think they're all legit. Most of them are, but there are some that kind of try to weasel in something that maybe isn't just right. And that's where it's our job to read those things over and then counsel accordingly, that if you're not comfortable, then you should have an attorney look at it. I'll eyeball certain things, but I'll tell you if that's out of my scope, that we need to, you know, definitely get an attorney involved. So yeah, one of the handouts here talks about the foreclosure process, how that works. Let me go to too many screens. All right, so this is land contract guide. Addendum, draft. All right, let me open up this one. It says. This is all this stuff I'll send you. So while you're here and you're online, make a note. You're gonna send me an email. I'll send you this stuff. So you got it and review it. Again, I don't need to read it over. We've touched on the highlights of what you should know. Going in, you're a little armed and dangerous. You can at least talk to somebody about how these all work, and some of the risks that are involved, and the benefits as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, just hang on. I want to open this up 1 minute and I just reloaded all my Microsoft stuff, so it's taking a while to verify. Come on. Other than that, how are we finding things back in the D? Slowing down a little bit?
I've got things in the pipeline, so I'm not going to say slowing down. Things are in progress.
All right. Progress is good. All right, this is good stuff too. Pretty much in a PDF format, on the PowerPoint. This gives you a pretty good breakdown. What should be in the land contract, what things you should be looking out for. So yeah, this is some good stuff right here. All right, any questions?
Nope, I think you answered all of them.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for attending. Have a great day. And we will see you later.
Okay.
Enjoy your walk.
All right. I'm back next week. I'm back in the office next week.
Okay, cool. See you
Okay.
then.
See you
All right.
next week. All right.
Bye.
Take care.